It's finally starting to feel like spring around here. We've still got a lot of snow down, but the temperature is starting to come up and it's starting to feel pretty good. So before we head down into the studio, I just wanted to come out here and kind of take this in a little bit because it's been a kind of a rough winter. So anyways, today what we're going to do in the studio is I'm going to be showing you guys how this tiger drawing was actually inked. So we're not focusing on the pencil drawing itself, but instead I'm going to be showing you the techniques that I used to ink this thing. Okay, so without further ado, let's head down to the studio and I will show you exactly how this was done. And as always, if you like what you're seeing, don't forget to share and subscribe, and please leave me some comments. All right, let's get started. So to prepare for the inking of this project, I went ahead and used my grid drawing, but I added the cross contour lines to help me later when I get ready to start putting in the fur. The supplies I'll be using for this project is black India ink, different types of watercolor brushes, a calligraphy pen with a fine tip nib, and some bristle brushes of various sizes. I'll add a list to the description of the materials that I use for this process. The bristle brushes are going to be used when we do the fur. I'll get into that technique here in a little bit. It's called dry brushing, and I'll explain that a little bit more when we get to that part of the video. There's a lot of steps into inking a project like this, so I'm going to be going back and forth between the traditional inking techniques with the washes and then also working with dry brush techniques, especially where I want the texture. So I decided to start with the eyes just to kind of get myself into a groove, and I'm using I would say about a middle range gray, and I'm only working on the outer portion of the eye. Then after this dries, then I'll go back and add the pupils a little bit later. While I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and take a moment and do the small portion of the mouth that we can see. So started off with probably a mid gray, and then where it goes deeper into the mouth, I'm just adding in a little bit of a darker gray, almost pure ink, and then before they dry, I'm just going to blend them together so that I have a nice gradient value from mid to dark. Alright, so let's take a look at dry brushing. What is dry brushing? So dry brushing is nothing more than applying paint, or in this case ink, with a brush that is almost completely dry. So I load the brush, I wipe off the extra ink, and then I barely skim the surface of the paper. When I skim the surface, I'm going to be pulling in the direction that I want the fur or the hair to flow. So the reason that I did all the cross contours in the grid drawing was to kind of help me figure out which direction the hair was going to go in. It's in this particular drawing, you're going to see that the fur is going in all kinds of different directions. So you'll see me spinning the paper out quite a bit so that I can always be putting in the fur in the direction that it needs to go. So here we go. I went ahead and started with the stripes. You'll notice that the stripes are not black. Okay. I started off with like a darkish gray, and what I'm doing is I'm putting in the textures and the value at the same time, paying close attention to the direction that I want the fur to flow. So I'm actually looking at not only my cross contours, which are off camera right now, but I'm also looking at the photograph of the tiger as well. The lines that I've drawn in, they're just guidelines. So when I'm done with this painting, I actually don't want to see those outlines. All I want to see is fur. So skimming the surface, always going in the direction that you want the fur to flow. Now this is kind of a tedious process, so you want to take your time when you do this. Put on some music or put on a book or something, and then just take your time. And I like to build this up in layers. So like some of the stripes are kind of like a mid gray right now, but then I'll go back and make part of them a little bit darker because I want to keep this as natural as I can. So I'm trying to avoid doing everything the same. I want to have some variety, and I'm definitely avoiding using outlines. All right, switching back to some traditional inking techniques, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit more work on the eye. So I'm going in with pretty much pure black ink, and I'm putting in that dark area that surrounds the pupils. When I'm working on a complex project like this, I like to break up the techniques. I don't like to stay on one technique for too long. So I'm taking a break here from the dry brushing so that I can work around the eyes, putting in these nice dark features that surround the pupil. And then once that's done, I'll go back to doing a little bit more dry brushing. Back to dry brushing. So now I'm going to start working on the main parts of the body, not just the stripes. And the process is pretty much the same. The only difference is that the direction of the fur has changed. So again, I'm using my cross contour lines to help me with that. And the value of the ink has to be a little bit lighter. So I've mixed up a little bit of a medium gray, um, and then just continue the process. All right, when I get to this big part of the body here behind the face, I'm still going to continue the process, but I'm making some additional changes. The biggest one is now I've actually added quite a bit of water to the ink to make it even lighter. Still using dry brush, so don't get that confused. Yes, you're adding water to the ink, but the brush itself, you still want to make sure that you're using very, very little fluid in it. And then the other change that I made is the length of the strokes. I'm making them considerably longer than the ones that I use for the stripes. But I still have to make sure that I'm following my cross contours so that I kind of get a general idea of what the fur is doing. If all goes according to plan, all of those outlines that were there that we started with will disappear and will be replaced with different types of fur, different values of fur, different directions of fur, and that's the goal. We don't really want to see outlines. We don't want this to look cartoony. We want it to look fairly realistic. So this process is just going to continue to repeat over and over again following the cross contour. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it into hyperdrive, and then I'll be back once all the fur is in place. If you'd like to learn more about the various inking techniques, please check out my inking techniques playlist on my YouTube channel. There you'll find how to do ink washes, how to do hatching, cross hatching, stippling, scribbling, and how to combine the techniques to get different effects. So when we get to the nose and the cheeks and I believe the lower jaw, those are going to have a smoother texture. So going back to the more traditional techniques, and I just started with the wet on wet. So I use my smaller watercolor brush, my number 2. I wet the inside portion of the nose, then I added a dark value near the bottom, and then I basically just used the water that was on the paper to move the ink around to make the top portion of it a little bit lighter. I repeat the process for the inner portion of the mouth. So I wet the area with my smaller brush and then go ahead and put in the inks right on top of the water, and that allows me to move the ink while it's still nice and wet. So here you can see on the cheeks are predominantly white, but we don't want them to be pure white. So I've taken some clean water, I've wet the entire area, and then I've put in a mid value, and then I blended it around while the area is wet. So I get this really nice soft shadow opposite of the light. Not a harsh shadow, but just not something really nice and soft. So wet on wet works really well for this. As the ink was beginning to dry, I felt like the shadow that I put on the left cheek wasn't quite strong enough, so I wet the area one more time and went in and added just one more layer and then blended them just to make sure that the shadow was deep enough. Now I've switched over to my calligraphy pen with the fine tip nib, and this is just for some little fine details. For this particular drawing, there's not a lot of nib work. Most of it I did with the brushes. There's just a few little areas that I want to refine just a little bit more, and I felt that I should do that with the nib instead of instead of trying to do it with the brush. One of the reasons why I love working with pen and ink is because you're using the same ink for with all of your equipment. You don't have to worry about different tips with different types of markers or different brands of markers or anything like that. You're using the same ink for everything. So once this step is done, I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to dry this thoroughly with my hair dryer. I'm going to do that off camera. You guys don't need to watch that. But the reason for that is before I actually start working on the background, I want to make sure that everything is dry. Alright, so we got everything nice and dry, and now we can start working on the background. So I want the background to stay really soft. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using a spray bottle and I'm misting the area behind the tiger. And then still working with the same ink, all I'm doing is I'm using the watercolor brush and I'm touching areas and just letting the water do the most of the inking for me. Not only is it doing, or excuse me, most of the mixing for me. Not only is it doing a pretty nice job with the mixing, but it also leaves some really interesting patterns. And I just like to let it happen. I don't, I, for this particular project, I try not to like overwork the background. I do have to keep tilting the board on because I want to make sure that anything that's dripping is dripping away from the tiger. And I do have some paper towels handy just in case a little bit of the ink gets where I don't want it, and then I can wipe it off. Alright, so we're on the home stretch here. So all I'm doing right now is I'm actually doing some very soft washes right on top of the texture. So the way that I do that is I take some clean water and I wet the area that I want to put a soft shadow in. And I always wet a larger area than I need. And then when I put the ink, I'll put it where I want the shadow to start. And then I wipe off my brush and I push it and let it fade. I never want to see a outline around any of my shadows. So it's a real easy technique to do. You just wet the area with clean water. You put a little bit of ink down and you move it around and soften the edges before the ink has a chance to dry. Because remember, once this ink dries, it's permanent. It's not going to go anywhere, which is a huge advantage because all of these washes that I'm doing right now, I can do right over the textures that I've already laid in there. So I don't lose any of the textures when I do this. I simply just put some glazing or some darker washes right on top of them. To me, this is a really important step because it really helps bring the entire drawing together. We know that different parts of the face are going to cast shadows on other parts of the faces, so it doesn't look like it's just pasted on. So I'm being very careful and looking at my reference materials and picking out which areas need to be a little bit darker. And again, I'm doing this with glazes because I want to be able to see all of the textures that are underneath. I don't want to lose those. So I simply wet the area, and then I go in with a medium or light gray, place it on the edge, and then fade it away. Um, I have to make sure that I fade those values so that they look natural. As I was looking the drawing over, I felt that the ear was blending into the background. So I decided to increase the contrast. Rather than making the ear darker, since that portion of the ear is supposed to be light, what I did is I wet the area behind the ear and then went in with a little bit of ink just to create, just to increase the contrast and get better separation between the ear and the background. I'm going to continue to go through this thing and make any final adjustments that I want to make. And then I'm just going to let it dry or force dry it. And then it'll be ready for the watercolors. Now you don't always have to use watercolors on top of the ink. So this drawing would work just as well as a black and white drawing as it would with the colors. So before I actually add the colors, I'm going to take a photograph of it and keep a record of it. Because once I add the watercolors, I'm not gonna be able to take them off completely. So, but I feel, as looking at this, I actually feel like this is a successful black and white drawing as well. So, all right, so here's the black and white version, completely done and ready to go, with the exception of the whiskers, which I won't put in until after the colors are added. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, please share and don't forget to subscribe. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.